When it was first announced that the Guardians of the Galaxy were coming to Marvel Champions, I don't think anybody could have been as excited as I was. I'm a huge fan of the movies, huge fan of the comics. I love these characters so much. So I was really looking forward to seeing the new direction the game was going in. Unfortunately, as you may or may not know, this box has quite a reputation for being unbelievably difficult. The villains really stepped it up a notch. I talked earlier about how people were starting to remark that maybe the game was a little too much on the easy side. It was hard to find a challenge. It was fun to play, but too easy. Well, the designers were listening and they responded. And my goodness, these villains are quite a step up from what we've seen before. But before I get to that, let's take a look at the heroes that come in this box. Like the Rise of the Red Skull before it, this campaign box came with 2 heroes and 5 villains. The heroes are Groot and Rocket, so we'll start by talking about Groot. Groot is a hero I honestly haven't played a ton. I really only used him when he was first new, when the box came out, and I did enjoy him, but for some reason I've never really gotten back to him. He has a really interesting mechanism where he gets these growth counters, and they basically act as extra defense. Every time he takes damage, he loses these growth counters. But you can use the growth counters for various things. He has cards to give him more. He can remove threat and deal damage equal to how many growth counters he has. He kind of has a split design, because what's happening here is you either want to collect the counters in order to do massive damage with cards like I Am Groot that says deal damage to an enemy equal to the number of growth counters on Groot. So that card can do up to 10 damage, and he has a threat one that does the same thing. But he also has cards like his upgrades down here, Entangling Vines, Lashing Vines, and Vine Shield. They want you to spend your counters in order to get really good effects for Groot. So you kind of have to make a choice. Do I want to collect counters or do I want to spend them? And on the one hand, that could make for some interesting deck building. You could decide you want to go sort of one way or the other. On the other hand, it makes him a little bit tricky to play, because sometimes you only want to use this half of his cards or that half of his cards. And so that, I think, puts him a little bit lower in the power rankings, because he's just not as consistent because of the way his cards work. But he is very cool. I actually really like him, and I've been itching to get him out again, because it is fun to collect those counters. We'll be talking about a hero very soon that collects counters that I love very, very much. He's my favorite hero. One thing about Groot that makes him tricky is he does have a really important alter ego ability that when you flip down, you can put 2 growth counters on him. It's sort of the main way you get growth counters. But he also only has a 1 thwart stat, and it makes it tough to go to alter ego. And that's definitely a theme I've noticed with heroes I'm not particularly fond of or don't play very often, are these heroes that it's sort of crucial to go to alter ego, but they're also not very good at thwarting, which is a rough combination for solo play. And multiplayer, it's probably fine. But in solo, it makes him a little bit tough. But I know he plays well in Justice because of that, because you need to go to alter ego. But either way, I do think he's a lot of fun and was an interesting start to the box. Now, he came as a protection hero, which makes sense because he has a 3 defense and his ability prevents damage. And he came with some really good protection cards and some good cards in general. Starhawk is a pretty darn good ally. Protection was really starved for good allies. He's 2 cost, and I've already said a couple times that 2 cost allies are always welcome. It doesn't even really matter what they do. But he has a really interesting ability where he can bounce back to your hand if he takes exactly his remaining hit points and damage. So that's kind of a fun little mini game you can play to try to pop him back and forth. Desperate Defense is really good. Fighting Fit was an interesting card. He introduced this idea that if you were at maximum health, you would get certain benefits. This card does more damage if you're at maximum health or higher. And then Dauntless is similar, where it basically gives you Retaliate, or it does give you Retaliate if you have your full hit points. So it's kind of a neat sort of deck archetype built right into Groot's deck here. But the real key card that came with Groot is Hard to Ignore. Protection really struggles with removing threat, and Hard to Ignore was huge. If you defend without taking damage, you get to exhaust it. It's an upgrade that comes into play. It stays in play. And you can exhaust it to remove a threat from the main scheme. And you get 2 or 3 of those out. Every time you're defending, you're removing 2 or 3 threat. That put protection way up. They needed that very badly. That's a huge card. And just introduced the idea of the perfect defense deck where you always wanted to block without taking damage. Unflappable came with, I believe it was Doctor Strange. And that was also the same way if you defended without taking damage. So they leaned into that idea for the protection, and it's a really fun way to play. And Groot, I think, solidified. That became a pretty solid deck type after Groot came out. He came with a Rocket Basic ally, and this is a theme we're going to see running through the Guardians allies that I absolutely loved, or the Guardians heroes, excuse me. That all of the main members of the Milano, all the the core team members of the Guardians are all basic allies. They don't have signature allies. Groot doesn't have a signature ally, but you can play with Rocket in him if you want to, but he's a basic ally. He can fit in anybody's deck. So that means anybody can use the Guardians allies in their deck, and it's a really neat thing that the Guardians always want to be together. So there's a basic version of all the allies, and here we see the version of Rocket that's a basic ally. He's really good. They had a team up card that continues. That's really good for those two to play together. And he had another major card here, Deft Focus, that only costs 1 as an upgrade, but it reduces the cost of the next superpower you play. And there are a lot of superpower cards in the game, and some heroes have a ton in their kit. Quicksilver has a lot, Groot has a lot, and others as well. And so this became an auto include in many decks. So whether or not you enjoyed playing Groot, man, he came with some really good cards that really helped the decks get stronger when this came out. And then we have Rocket Raccoon, which, if I had to hazard a guess, I think most people probably prefer Rocket to Groot because he is an absolute joy to play. His ability revolves around dealing damage to minions, and if you do excess damage, more than enough to kill them, then you get to draw a card, and there's no limit to that. So there are certain scenarios where you can just go crazy with Rocket and draw piles and piles of cards, and it's really fun. And his alter ego allows him to scrap out tech upgrades to draw cards too, and his whole thing is he has various weapons and battery packs and things that he can bring into play that have counters on them, and then when they're empty, you can just go to your alter ego and discard them to draw more cards. So he works really well. He plays particularly well in Justice, I find. I think he is a very fun hero. So for all the things I'm going to say about the villains here shortly, please don't just run away from this box screaming, because the heroes, I think, are worth it. I think Rocket alone almost makes it worth it, and the deck building cards for getting this box. Rocket came in Aggression, as you might expect, and he had the Bug ally, which became very popular. You see him in a lot of decks. His ability is that he can basically stay alive. He takes the damage, and then if you attack with your hero, he heals. So you can keep him on the board, and maybe you just need a 1 thwarter to stay and play the whole game. He can do the job for you. Into the Fray was a really big card. It gave Aggression a way to remove threat pretty reliably. Looking for Trouble summons minions, which certain heroes very much want that to happen. That was a great card for Thor and just certain deck builds in general. Follow Through, another interesting card that sort of created a deck all on its own that increases the amount of excess damage you deal, which combos very well with certain other cards. Hand Cannon, a very useful upgrade. These are all like top tier aggression cards. So Rocket was a very good hero to get. And Groot, the basic Groot ally, I think is probably the best Guardian, or maybe top 2 neutral allies. That he is very strong. Every time he blocks and he survives, he heals 2 damage. So he can just stand in front of minions the whole game, or even maybe take a couple hits from the villain for you. He's got 6 health. He's a very good ally, and I typically include him in all of my Guardians decks. He's just so useful. The Booster Boots are a really good basic card that I tend to put in Guardians decks. There are a lot of cards that were Guardian specific, similar to how there were a lot of cards that were Avenger specific in the earlier cycles. The Guardians really had their own flavor and had a whole suite of cards that worked so well that only they can use, and it makes them feel very distinct from the Avengers and makes them just a really neat way to play the game that feels different than what we knew from before. So the box is off to a really good start when we come to talk about the heroes. But when it came to the villains, it was just crazy the difference between these villains and the villains in the Rise of the Red Skull box. They were immediately and just instantly, obviously, so much harder. Now, with all that being said, I actually only have good things to say about Drang, the first villain in the campaign. I find him to be one of the best villains in the whole game. I play Drang a lot. He is incredibly fun. He has a decent challenge. He's not overly difficult for what we're going to be talking about here soon with the rest of the villains, but he's really just a pretty straightforward. But you learned very quickly when you started playing, if you look at his scheme here, it goes up by 2 per player every turn, and that was probably the first time we had seen that in the game. Typically schemes only go up by 1 per player, and right away you realized you had to fight Drang quickly. He puts a lot of threat on the scheme very fast, and it's just kind of hard to keep up. Now, this is compensated for by the fact that there is a modular set called Ship Command that comes with the Milano, the Guardian ship, and in most cases, you can exhaust the Milano to remove 3 threat from a scheme, and often the main scheme is one of the schemes you can target, so that was meant to compensate for the threat going up so fast. But even with that help, it was still hard to keep up with these schemes, and that continues throughout pretty much all 5 of these, and the typical strategy of just take your time, build up your hero, and then finish the villain whenever you're darn well ready to do it didn't really apply in the Galaxy's Most Wanted. You had to move fast. It really encouraged a rush style strategy. But Drang, again, I don't want to say anything bad about Drang. He is really, really fun. He comes with a lot of small minions that are fun to beat up. He just has a good mix of side schemes and minions. His main gimmick is that he puts counters on his ship, and then every 4 counters he does some damage to you. It's really not a big deal, but it's something to keep an eye on. So Drang, I actually really love. He's a villain I play a lot with like deck testing and stuff. I get him out. He's always a good time. But unfortunately, things go downhill very, very quickly with the Collector. Now you'll see here it says Collector 1 because there are actually 2 Collector scenarios. And the first one, the Infiltrate the Museum, is notoriously annoying because his whole mechanism is that he steals cards from your deck, but he also takes his own cards and he puts them in what's called the collection, where it's just a set aside area of cards. But depending on the number of players, if the collection gets to a certain amount, in solo it's only 5, so it's basically 5 per player, you just lose the game. And there are so many ways he has to put cards in the collection, and you can remove cards from the collection once per turn. You can either exhaust your hero or pay a couple resources to get a card back, but you can only remove 1 a turn, and it's not hard for him to put 2 or 3 in there on a turn if you're unlucky, and there's just nothing you can do about it. And so in solo play, beating him is almost just an act of luck. If you just have to kill him really fast, and you have to hope he doesn't draw the right combination of cards to fill the collection up. And it's really too bad because it's a really neat idea, and I like the concept. I really like the character, but it's not balanced very well for solo play, so it makes it really frustrating. And when you're trying to play through the campaign, which I said before that I'm not that big into the campaigns, but what little I have played of it is just that much harder. And so it's frustrating that you have a really hard time getting past this darn villain. You're trying to enjoy the story of the campaign and move forward, and you can get stuck on him for a while because he can just get lucky and beat you. You know, he has treacheries right here that just puts a card right into the collection. He steals the cards you have in play that you paid resources for. He can just take the top card of your deck and put it in the collection randomly. Almost. It's really frustrating. Anytime a card leaves play, they go into the collection. And so you have to be very, very careful, and you have to build a very specific deck type in order to hope to reliably get past the collector. And this is probably my least favorite scenario in the entire game. I said Absorbing Man was probably the easiest and the most boring. I find this the most annoying. And it makes me sad to say that because I really like the idea, and I've had fun playing it. It's not a miserable experience, but it can be really frustrating. So you bump into this guy and you're instantly like, what's going on with this box? And then we get to the Collector 2, and this kind of goes in the complete opposite direction, where it's sort of really easy if you're playing Justice. The whole idea of this scenario is that you're actually not worried so much about defeating the Collector, reducing his hit points to 0. You have to move your way through his main schemes here, and you have to remove all the threat, similar to if you've played the Lord of the Rings card game. It's all about, questing or removing threat instead of dealing damage. And I loved that idea. Big fan of the Lord of the Rings card game. And this one can be a lot of fun. It's almost a race just to try to remove all the threat before you lose. But this one is completely trivialized by Justice. You can win this in just a few turns by removing the threat. And there's even a built-in card, this library, that you can take a face-on encounter card to remove 5 threat. So you can use that to help speed you through. And so just depending on your deck type, this is a wildly different experience. But if you play Justice, you're going to crush it because you can just quickly remove all the threat and win. If you're not playing Justice, this one's actually pretty fun. I want to be clear, not all the villains in this box are terrible. I don't know that any of them are terrible, but there are a couple scenarios that I enjoy, and this one can be a lot of fun in the right circumstances. And it's nice. Like you quickly saw with this box, they were trying some pretty different things from quest to quest, from scenario to scenario. Each one feels radically different, which is nice. That's good. That's what you want. You definitely see some advances in scenario design. but the difficulty is sort of all over the place. And like I said, if you just play Justice, you're going to win this no problem every time. And then we come to Nebula. And my goodness, Nebula is just something else. When you fight Nebula, you have no idea what you're going to get. You might get a really fun time. The cards might fall right, and you get a good challenge, and you have a fun time. But more often than not, what you're going to do is you're going to get surged to death on the second turn. And there's not much you can do about it. She has this ship that gets counters, and that determines how much threat she gets. And you have to sort of pay a tax to keep the ship counters low so that the threat doesn't get out of hand. But all the while you're trying to do that, she's pumping out tons of everything else. She gets these technique cards that all have, the first one comes out and has surge, and they give her all kinds of annoying abilities. And just surge, surge, surge. If there's one word to describe Nebula, it's just surge, surge, surge. Hey, there's some surge, there's some surge. Lots of surge. And it's just incredibly frustrating because, like I said, there's just nothing you can do about it. And she will just destroy you. She's just way too hard. I hate to say that. I actually like this scenario. I've beaten it plenty of times. It's not impossible. It's just so random. It is so frustrating how, I don't know, variable, I guess you could say it is. But if you want a good challenge, if you want to take somebody on that you really don't know if you're going to be able to beat or not, you have a really strong deck that you want to try, and you don't mind losing a few games outside of your control to get a very satisfying win, Nebula is good for that. Again, I have nothing but good to say about the ideas of these villains. The designs are really, really neat, and they made you play the game in different ways, mostly rush, because you just want to kill these villains as fast as you can. You can't let any of them hang around. If she sticks around too long, you are going to get behind on that ship, and you're not going to be able to keep up with the threat. And that's a loss. And then it's going to be another loss. So Nebula is probably towards the bottom, I think, of many people's favorite villains just because of all the surge. She just runs away with the game, and sometimes it can happen so early there's no way to recover. And you don't really get to play the fun game that you took the time setting up. So I want to say nice things about Nebula. I'm a huge fan of the character, but the scenario has beaten me up way too many times for me to be too kind to it. So I guess this is my chance to get a little revenge on Nebula. But Nebula's got nothing on Ronan. This is next level stupid hard. Everything I just said about Nebula, crank it up by 10. This guy will kill you on the first turn, and I'm not even kidding. If you are not careful, and even if you are careful, because similar to Nebula, sometimes there's nothing you can do, he will just destroy you. This is hands down the hardest villain in the game. This is still the true today. And if we wanted our big bad scenario to try to build the strongest decks to take against, I guess this is it, but I don't even know how much fun it is. He's just really strong in every way a villain can be strong. He gets toughness, he has high stats, he attacks a lot, he has high threat side schemes that are difficult to remove. You're getting tons and tons of extra encounter cards because he has this Kree command ship right here that you can't get rid of, that's always adding an extra encounter card to the first player. So if you're solo, every time. There is a mechanism where you can cancel one of the cards, and that's fun. I guess that's kind of where the strategy lies in Ronan, is the fact that you can cancel one of your treacheries every turn. So kind of deciding when you're going to do that is a big part of it. He has this hammer, this universal weapon that gives him stalwart, so you can't just stun and confuse him. You can get rid of it, but 9 times out of 10, the second you get rid of it, it just comes right back out. And he has probably the dumbest card in the whole game, Fanaticism, that gives him extra attack with overkill and piercing. So you can't even try to get tough to prevent the attacks. You can't get chump blocking to prevent the attacks. And he gets 2 of the counters. He basically gets to do this twice for his next 2 attacks, which means that he has 2 attacks coming that you cannot avoid. And the card has Surge. Probably the hardest encounter card in the whole game, and it has Surge. It's just crazy. It's crazy. It's almost kind of funny, really, if you think about like how nuts these cards are. Like I haven't played Ronan much because I found him immediately not fun. When the Galaxy's Most Wanted came out, I actually had some decent success with it at first. I was playing a very popular Scarlet Witch Justice deck. I think it was called Turbo Draw. And it was really strong. And I actually got through the first 4 villains, even Nebula, pretty easily. So I'm thinking, okay, what's everybody talking about with this box? It's not that hard. And then I took that deck, which was probably the strongest deck of its day, against Ronan, and I couldn't beat him. I just couldn't do it. And maybe that's on me. I'm not saying I'm the best player in the world or anything, but it was just like, wow, what a difference he was from even from Nebula. And some people sort of make it their goal to get at least one win on Ronan. I've never bothered. I just gave up. I'm sure there are decks that can beat him now. Or I know for a fact there are, but I'm okay. Maybe I'll get around to doing it one of these days. But if you've heard of anything from this box, you've heard of Ronan. And if that's your thing, if you want the hardest challenge in the game, then this is the place to go. He will give you that challenge. So I said a lot of mean things about the villains, and I'm not alone in that. I don't hate the box, and I have had a lot of fun with Drang, and I've had some decent fun with Nebula at times and the second collector scenario. But I never play Ronin, and I almost never play Collector 1. But there are a lot of good things about this box, and the modular sets is one of them. They have a ton of flavor, and they are a really, really fun set of sets. So we have the Band of Badoon, which I think has 10 of them, and they're all just little minions. Well, not all little. This lieutenant's pretty big, but they're mostly little swarmy minions that just come pumping out of the deck, and they are a lot of fun to play against. They have a lot of cool effects. They can be obviously annoying. When I say fun, they're hard, but it's just fun to smack these little guys around. And I really, really like this modular encounter set. The Galactic Artifacts one is super interesting, where it's a lot of attachments for the villain. There are a lot of interesting side schemes in it. This one just really changes up. Any deck that you put this in, you're going to have a very different experience from the way you normally play that villain. And I think that's great. I love this encounter set. It's really, really neat. Kree Militants is a little on the harder side if you want to jack up maybe an easier villain. These are the guys that hang out in the Ronin deck if you play it the way it's meant to be set up. And there's a lot of, you see the 6 hit points, 6 hit points, 7, 7. These are some really, really scary, beefy minions. And so these will jack up any villain. So if you're tired of beating up on Rhino or Absorbing Man, want a little bit more of a challenge, these guys will take it up a notch. And that's a good thing. Menagerie Medley is really interesting, but it can be super annoying. These psionic ghosts come out and they just confuse you. They're a pain to deal with. The servant bots are not that hard to get rid of, but they have guard and patrol, so if they come out at the wrong time. But really, the thing that makes it so scary is this space shark. A star shark. Who needs a shark in space? This thing is awful. It has 3 attack, quick strike, 7 hit points, and he deals indirect damage, which sometimes is good because you can spread out the damage, but sometimes it's also a more of a hassle to deal with. Also, it introduced all kinds of rules. Questions. I don't think any of us knew how to handle indirect damage when this thing came out. We were all very confused. I think we figured it out by now, but yeah, this thing caused all kinds of problems, and his boost effect is nasty. To deal 1 damage to each character you control, can wipe out your allies. This is a pretty tough encounter set, and I'll admit I don't include it very often, mostly because of these sharks. They're just really, really rough. The Space Pirates are another really fun one that have a lot of the smaller minions. These guys come out and they actually remove your cards from the game, which is really scary effect. And but it changes things up and it makes you play in a different way, and that's what you want from these modular encounter sets. So I'm a fan of this one. I like to play with this one fairly occasionally. And the ship command is just so cool. So this is the kind of thing that drives the campaign, and this modular set is the Milano. It comes into play at the beginning of the game. It's always out there. You can use it for a resource, but most of the time you're probably going to be using it for various effects of the scenario. They make you exhaust the Milano for this or that, and you're usually going to want to save it for that. But it's just thematically, it's really cool. But there's a lot of pretty tough. This is actually a pretty tough encounter set, and it's probably meant to balance the fact that it's giving you this free resource every turn. The Rogue Vessel is a very annoying card, and a lot of the treacheries just make you choose things, which is fun. It's nice to have the choices, but usually they're not fun choices. And so this is a fun one to include, and it's just kind of neat, the idea that you're fighting Claw, but you also have the spaceship that's hanging out with you. It's almost like you feel like whoever you put this in, you feel like you're fighting them in space, and that's really neat. They did an amazing job with this. And then we have the Power Stone, which is technically an encounter set, which is kind of strange. It's just 1 card, and it's sort of a ping pong, where you attach it to the villain, but if you hit them for 3, you get to take it, and then if they hit you for 3 or more, they get to take it, and it just gives you +1/+1. It can be fun to throw in once in a while. It's a part of the campaign story more than anything. It goes on Nebula, goes on Ronin. But it can be fun to throw this in a deck every now and then, and just to see see what happens with it. Now, I haven't talked about the campaign much, but I do want to talk about it some, because as hard as the villains are in just regular play, if you play them in campaign, they're just insane. They get so many extra cards, so many extra bonuses, and what's meant to counteract that is this market right here, which is probably the coolest thing, if one of the coolest things we've seen in the whole game, are these market cards, where the campaign gimmick of this particular box is that you get experience points and you can spend them on these, or you get units, I guess, and you can spend them on these cards to add to your deck, and they're all really strong. And the more units you can get some really, really powerful cards. Just let me try to find a really, really cool one here. Like this In Defiance right here. It only costs 1 experience. You can use it to prevent 2 damage and draw a card. That's an incredibly useful card. It doesn't seem like much, but that's really useful, and that's only 1 cost. If we look at some of the really high ones, like Sure Gamble here costs 0 cost event. You get to reduce the resource cost of the next card played this phase by 3. So it's basically a 3 resource card that you can use for any player for 0. It's really, really neat. This Safeguard gives 2 friendly characters a tough status card and lets you draw a card. They're so good. They're hard to get though, because the units, they're pretty tough to come by. You have to do certain things in the scenarios, and you have to clear out side schemes and also like meet certain conditions. So it can be really tough to get enough points to get all the best cards. But it's such a neat idea, and it really draws you into wanting to play the campaign, because you want to get these cards. It's the only way. I have a whole stack of, there's a lot of these cards, and the only way you can play them is if you're playing the campaign of this box. And the campaign of this box is, I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating, but it's kind of a miserable experience. It's just so dang hard, because we look at it, so everybody gets an extra side scheme that starts into play, and this is, you get these victory 1 here, and this is how you get the units to buy these cards, and these start in play, and for the most part they don't really do anything until we get into the later. So here, when you beat Drangs, everybody gets to draw a card. That's great. It starts with 5 threat and solo, which is kind of a lot, but it doesn't do anything bad to you. It just lets you draw a card. So if you want to do it, you can. You get a unit, you draw a card. It's awesome. But then we go straight to Collector. It starts with 6 threat if you're in solo, and if you defeat it, you have to put a card into the collection. That's not even fun. That's bad. That's putting you closer to losing. And the same thing with the Collector 2. It deals the damage to everybody. But the most egregious one is Nebula's. Not so much in the standard, though it is bad. It puts 2 evasion counters on her ship, and it has 8 threat. So you don't have to get rid of it in standard if you don't want to. But if you play this on the expert mode, I'm just going to show you this. If you play in the expert campaign, it comes into play with an acceleration icon and a hazard icon, puts 3 evasion counters on it if you do decide to defeat it, and you probably want to because it has a hazard and an acceleration, but it has 10 threat in solo. That's nuts. Where are these numbers coming from? Who thought these were a good idea? Look at Ronin's. Has acceleration, an amplify, and a hazard, 11 threat. Come on. What were they thinking? But, so that's part of it. And there are other things in the book that they get various bonuses if you play the campaign. The Badoon Headhunter is actually a pretty cool element of the campaign. You start out with just him in the deck, and if you defeat him, you get 2 victory points, 2 units, which is nice. And then if you did defeat him, you add another card from his set the next time, and each time you defeat him specifically, you add another card of his encounter, and they're very, very difficult. They all have surge, and they all do nasty things. They all have boost effects. Most of them have boost effects, I guess. But I actually really like that part of the campaign. It's like this ongoing second side villain that's always chasing after you, and every time you defeat him, he comes back a little bit stronger. Such a cool idea. So many cool ideas in this box. I just wish it weren't so hard, and I wish there were a way to play it where it was fun without really having to house rule it. And I feel like that's where I am with it. If I'm going to play it again, I'm going to have to find a way to house rule it. Now, maybe with newer, stronger heroes, it could be fun. But even then, I don't know. I've been so put off by it. And I've probably put you off by it as well. And I do feel kind of bad for that because I don't want to. The heroes are really fun. The deck building cards are really fun. And you might really enjoy these scenarios. You might like the challenge. You might think it's fun. So this is just my personal experience. I'm definitely not going to tell anybody to not buy any Marvel Champions product. I think you should buy them all. So I'm not trying to put you off of it. I'm just sort of describing my experience and what I think a lot of players' experience are. So that was the Galaxy's Most Wanted. Hoo boy, what a box. So after we were all battered and beaten up and bruised from trying to work our way through the Galaxy's Most Wanted campaign with Rocket and Groot, there was a little bit of salvation offered in the form of Star-Lord. Star-Lord is probably, in my opinion, one of the most fun heroes in the game and incredibly powerful. He has an ability where you can take an extra encounter card and reduce the cost of a card by 3. And that is really, really strong. Now, it's really risky and could lead to bad things. So thematically, it's fantastic, as he is notoriously stupid in the choices he makes sometimes, but he always seems to find a way to get out of it. I think Star-Lord's a great character, and he is a lot of fun to play. He has other cards that will give you face-down encounter cards to give you bonuses, and he can pump out a ton of damage because of this sliding shot that deals 5 damage plus 2 more for every encounter card you have in front of you. So if you use his ability to pay for it, that's already 7 that you didn't have to pay any resources for and deal 7 damage. But if you've got other encounter cards in front of you and there's other ways to get them, like I said, that can pretty much blow up a whole stage of a villain in one shot. So this is one of the premier rush heroes in the game. Star-Lord can easily win a game in 3 turns, 2 if you're very lucky. And so he can really technically beat any villain because he can just kill them before they can really get going. And I think if Star-Lord had been in the box instead of, say, Groot, I think the box would have a very different reputation. I think Star-Lord suddenly made it possible to go back and like, okay, maybe now we can actually fight some of these villains. He just feels very strong. You can get pretty unlucky if you pull the wrong encounter cards for sure. But he has a lot of really neat stuff. He has this element gun that you have in play, and you can simply discard a card to deal 3 damage with piercing. It's a great way to deal with all the tough enemies that are in the box. They're really nice. Bad Boy lets you escape back to Alter Ego. He's really, really good. He has Leader of the Guardians that gives all your characters plus all your Guardian characters plus 1 thwart. And when he's in his hero form, all of your allies have the Guardian trait. So this card gives all of your allies plus 1 thwart no matter who they are. Star-Lord's helmet helps him draw extra cards. This was a really strong hero, really fun hero. Not everybody likes him. That risky style of taking extra encounter cards for benefits isn't for everyone. There's a real gamble element to it. And I know for sure that there are a lot of players who prefer to play just a more steady, controlled version of the game. And so this hero is not for them. It's totally fine. But in the right hands, you can do a lot of cool things with Star-Lord, and you can have a lot of fun with him. Now, his deck building cards were also pretty strong. Adam Warlock and Yondu are very, very good allies. Beta Ray Bill is good. He's just very expensive, and so you think he's good in Star-Lord because you can get that cost down by 3. Outside of Star-Lord, are you going to pay 5 for him? I don't know. You get a lot of value out of him, but 5 is just a lot to ask. But Air Supremacy is a decent card. You can build up an aerial deck. They started pushing the aerial stuff a little bit, I think with this pack, actually, if I remember correctly. Blaze of Glory was an incredibly powerful card for the Guardians that gave every Guardian character in play +2/+2 thwart and attack for the phase. And then at the end of the phase, you deal 1 damage to each character, but that's a small price to pay for doing a lot of damage, or you're probably, if you played it, there's a good chance you just used it to win the game. Target Practice is just okay. I never really messed with that card too much. Laser Blaster is really good. You can put it on your allies to give them +1 and overkill. That's really useful. Cosmo's been a really popular ally. He's fun with certain heroes like Doctor Strange because of his ability to cycle through various decks. You can use him in some interesting combo ways. CITT, or I've always assumed is meant to be pronounced Kit, like Knight Rider that Peter Quill is such a fan of, is a really, really useful card in Guardian decks. You can simply spend 2 resources to ready somebody, and there's always going to be a good target for that somewhere on the board. Nowhere is huge to give you a card draw back after somebody plays a Guardian ally. Very, very helpful. Pulse Grenade, I was never a big fan of it, but in certain decks it can be really strong. You can deal a lot of damage with it. And so he had a lot of really good cards. He's a very, very fun deck to play. Yes, he did come with the aerial cards. Dive Bomb was always a so-so card until a recent card called Hone Technique came out that turned this into just a game-winning powerhouse. Agile Flight, I think, is still just okay. It removes a lot of threat, but that's all it does. It's not that exciting. But Ever Vigilant is a fantastic card. If you have a hero that can easily get aerial, this suddenly made protection their best aspect. This card is so good. It readies your hero and removes 2 threat from the main scheme. Protection always struggles with removing threat, so every single card in green that removes threat is going to be useful, and it readies your hero. This is a really, really fun card to use, and I use it every time I'm playing an aerial hero. I think that's a lot of fun. And they reprinted the enhanced cards again for some reason. I'm not sure why we need so many of those, but you've got plenty of them if you've bought all the cards. So that was Star-Lord. Highly, highly recommended. He's one of my favorite heroes. He is a lot of fun, but be aware if you don't like risk, if you don't like gambling with your card games, he might not be for you. But if Star-Lord's not for you, Gamora might be, because she's pretty much the polar opposite of Star-Lord. Where Star-Lord is all about just crazy risks and just trying stuff and seeing if it works, Gamora is all about methodical, careful, consistent threat removal and damage. Her ability that if you play a thwart event, you get to deal a free damage, and if you play a damage event, you get to remove a threat, is just unbelievably consistent. It's so easy to manage the board. When she came out, she felt very, very powerful. And I think of her in a similar way to like a Captain America, where she can just sort of do whatever you want her to do. She just plays, she can handle everything on the board. You could build her deck kind of however you want to. Now it does focus heavily on events, but it's not hard to get her free abilities here, where you can almost always guarantee you're going to be able to remove a threat and deal the damage. And in solo, just a guaranteed one threat removal every turn is huge, because you're just counteracting that natural threat gain, unless you're playing the Galaxy's Most Wanted, because they get 2 per turn. But you know what I'm saying. It's just really incredibly useful. And she had a lot of fun cards. Her cards really combo with each other, where if you play an attack event, your thwart event is stronger. And if you play a thwart event, your attack event is stronger. That was a really fun thing to do. Nebula was an excellent signature ally. She only costs 2. There's not very many signature allies that are only 2, and she has good numbers. She has a useful ability. It's very, very strong. Cross counter is just such a cool card. She can play it to prevent 3 damage, and then it also triggers her special abilities. So by the time you're done playing this card, you will have prevented 3 damage, done 2 damage, and removed 2 threat, all for 1. That's incredibly, incredibly good. So she mostly just has a lot of events. You don't really build a strong board with Gamora. It's more about just whatever the events in your hand and making the most of them. She does have some useful upgrades. She has a couple resource producing cards, which is nice. Her sword is big. If you can afford to get it out, it'll do even more damage. And a conditioning room helps you get some of your cards back. So she is a very consistent, very straightforward, and it had to be intentional that she's just the complete opposite of Star-Lord. And so again, I kind of said this with Star-Lord, but it's true. If you had her and him to take those Galaxy's Most Wanted villains, I think you'd had a much different experience than with Rocket and Groot. These two are definitely stronger than those two, in my opinion, and probably could have made a better go of managing that campaign. Unfortunately, by the time these guys came out, maybe we were all already fed up with it. I don't know. But her deck building cards were also really good. Angela is an excellent ally, 0 cost, but you go fetch a minion. And that sounds bad, but there's actually a lot of heroes that would love to go fetch a minion for various benefits. So that's a really, really useful ally, and a 0 cost jump blocker that you're going to get a couple of attacks out of is awesome, even at the cost of a minion. Clobber is a really neat card, where if it's the first card you play, you get to put it back in your hand. We're going to see a thwart event that does something similar. As a really neat idea. I wish we had seen more of that, and I hope we do see more ideas like that in the future, where it matters when you play the card. I like that idea. Plan of attack is okay. You're giving up a card to search for an attack event, so you're swapping it for an attack event, but if you don't find one, that's kind of a waste. So I don't know. I've never liked that card very much. First hit, I never really liked very much. Yeah, impede removes threat, and then if it's the first card you played, it comes back to your hand. Unfortunately, it only removes from the main scheme. I always prefer thwart events that can remove from side schemes as well. And she came with the Drax neutral ally, and he's really fun. Godslayer is a really cool card that will boost your attack greatly. It's expensive, so you might not get it into play. Hit and Run is an interesting card. It's a 3 cost event that deals 2 damage to an enemy and removes 2 threat, so you get a lot of value out of it. But it really feels particularly good with her, because if she plays it, that also triggers her abilities. So she really gets to deal 3 damage, remove 3 threat. Outside of her, I've never thought that card was terribly good. See, her off aspect cards. Pivotal Moment is kind of hard to make work, but it's a neat idea. Comms Implant's pretty good for adding extra thwart to an ally. And True Grit, I've never really found a hero that this is particularly good for, that if you defend against an attack, you get to remove threat equal to your thwart. I mean, that's a nice idea, but a hero with high thwart and high defense, I don't think there's too many of those roaming around. Now, I'm sure there's combos and stuff, but yeah, it's just okay. But Gamora as a hero, lots of good cards in here. Highly, highly recommend. And then with Drax, we kind of bounce back into Star-Lord territory, where we have somewhat of a risky play style. Drax's whole thing is he wants to be attacked And then every time he is attacked by the villain, he gets a vengeance counter. And then once he's full up on vengeance counter, he starts drawing cards. This is my favorite hero in the game. He has been since the day he came out. I don't know what it is. I shouldn't even like this hero so much. I'm not usually into just the attack straightforward kind of heroes. I just think he's incredibly fun. I love trying to get those counters. And he has a ton of really fun cards. So Manus is there to heal him. He has 14 hit points, but since he's getting attacked so often, you need somebody around to heal you. Fight Me Coward makes the villain attack you, and then you get to draw a card and ready. But you also get that vengeance counter, so that makes it worth it. He very much struggles in the thwarting department. Intimidation is a good thwart event where it removes threat equal to his attack, and his attack gets boosted by those vengeance counters. But he only has a thwart of 1, and you're always wanting to attack with him, so it can be difficult to manage the threat with him. He very much just wants to rush down the villain, get build up as fast as he can, and then just kill. And he's pretty darn good at it with cards like Knife Leap that deal 5 extra damage with a overkill and piercing, and the cost, it looks expensive, but it's actually reduced by the vengeance counter, so there's a very good chance this card will be free. And the whole thing is driven by this Dweethite Mastery here. After he makes a basic attack, draw a card, and there's no limit to that. There's lots and lots of ways to ready Drax between his deck and also in the general card pool, and you get to draw a card every single time he attacks. So once he gets set up, you're going to win pretty quickly because you're going to draw cards to keep fueling him to just keep attacking over and over and over. He can get piercing, he can get overkill. So whatever the villain throws in front of him, he's probably going to be able to chew through it. But like I said, you're going to have to, because with him, you're not really even trying to remove the threat. You're just trying to kill the villain before he schemes out on you, which I think is a really fun way to play. It's a completely different way to play. I don't think there's any other heroes I would really say that about, that you sort of have to do that. Now, you could probably play him in Justice and try to manage the threat, but I pretty much only play him in Protection. That's how he came, because you just want to prevent damage, and Protection actually has a lot of readying, so that works very well for him. And yeah, he's just all about getting high attack and killing the villain quickly, and I think he is just an unbelievably large amount of fun to play in this game. Now, like I said, he came as a Protection hero. He had some kind of weird allies, Martyr and Moondragon. I've never really used either of them. They're kind of pricey for what they do, but they have some interesting effects. Yeah, Counterpunch, Deflection's not that good. Hard Knocks is an interesting card. Protection doesn't have a lot of direct damage cards. And it deals 4 damage to an enemy. If it's defeated, you get a Tough. That's a lot of value for 3. So that is a good card if you've got a good target for it. Now, Drax kind of has a hard time paying for it because he only has a 4 hand size. But once he gets set up, he can draw a lot of cards. Leading Blow is an amazing card that really feels like was made specifically for Drax. But it is really, really fun. That might ready you and let you make an extra attack depending on the boost icons that you flip off the encounter deck. Subdue is very good. That reduces the attack of the villain by 3, and there are reasons at times that you would rather do that than prevent damage. So that is a really neat card. And he came with Gamora. Gamora is an excellent. She's probably the best of the neutral Guardian allies. Every time she attacks or thwarts, you flip cards off the top of your deck until you find an event and add it to your hand. So it's basically a card draw. And card draw is just always good. And the fact that she can trigger it a few times is really, really nice. And athletic conditioning is pretty much terrible. So not only is Drax my favorite hero, but he came with just some incredibly good cards. His off aspect cards bring it. A red event that lets you draw a card for every minion engaged with you. This made the minion summoning deck just really sing and basically created it in just a really fun way to play. Think Fast is the card to play if you're playing Justice Guardian. It lets you easily confuse the villain, and so you can flip down, and most of the Guardians have a pretty decent reason to want to flip down. So that is a great, great card. And Regroup is just an insanely good leadership card that lets you return allies to hand when they're defeated by attacks. And it works for the whole table for a round, so you play it. And then everybody that chump blocks around the table gets to put their allies back in their hand. That's just incredible for one. Even in solo, it's still worth playing in the right scenarios. So yeah, obviously I'm not going to say anything but the best of possible things about Drax. He's my favorite hero, but he really did come with some amazing cards as well. I think this would be a really, really hard pack to pass up. And lest I sound like a broken record, Venom is really good. Seriously, the Guardian cycle was just filled with excellent heroes. The game had really hit its stride by then. It's hard to say that because it was always good and there weren't really too many mistakes or misses along the way. But it just really felt like the Guardians had stepped it up a notch. They were super fantastically fun to play. And maybe they were so strong because they were meant to counteract the campaign box, but they definitely feel strong. Gamora, Star-Lord, and Venom all feel really strong. Now, I love Drax, and he could be a lot of fun, but I wouldn't say he's one of the most powerful heroes because he's pretty easy to lose with. But Venom is probably one of the most powerful heroes. He has so much board control. His ability to deal himself a damage to generate a resource is just so instantly useful right from the start of the game. It makes it easy to play your cards. His kind of thing is you have to hit certain resource types to trigger the kickers on his cards, but he can confuse the villain. He can cancel attacks and stun. But his main thing is he wants to get his guns into play. He has, scroll down here for a second. He has 2 pistols that give him +1 to all of his basic stats when he activates them. And he has the multi-gun, which in my opinion is one of the absolute best cards in the whole game, that you can exhaust it for one of 3 effects. You can either deal 2 damage to an enemy, choose a player to deal 1 damage to all their minions, or remove 2 threat from a scheme. And to have that on the board, if you can get it early in play, which there's a good chance you will, because his setup ability is that you flip cards from your deck until you find a weapon. And so if you don't put a lot of weapons in your deck, there's a good chance the multi-gun will be the one that pops out. And it's just, you get that on the board early and you're going to have a really good control of the game the whole time. If nothing else, you'll be able to remove 2 threat a turn without even exhausting your hero. That's really good. Spider Sense lets him draw cards when he gets attacked, makes him similar to Spider-Man, which is really neat. He has good damage. He has a really good alter ego support that heals him or draws cards. Run and gun is sort of what makes him sing. It readies him and all of his weapons so you can attack. And he's so versatile because you can exhaust him and his guns to do a big chunk of either damage or threat removal or defense if you wanted to. And then you use the multi-gun to do something else. And then you run and gun to ready everything, and then you could go in a completely different direction the second time around. So he can just do so much damage and threat removal, and he just really manages the board in a fun way. I like Venom a lot. There's some criticism that he sort of plays very one note, and that's just all about getting out the weapons, and that's valid. But I guess it doesn't bother me. I think he's just a really fun hero to play. And his deck building cards, he came in Justice. Jack Flag is a pretty interesting ally where you sort of build him up, where you thwart with him 1 turn, then he gets a counter, then you can use that to deal damage. He's pretty neat. Now, 4-cost allies I find very difficult to play, and rarely do I play them. But Jack Flag's one I've put in decks a few times. He's pretty neat. Scare Tactics, they kind of introduced this idea in this deck of dealing damage to enemies that are confused. And this card, I don't know, it's okay, but 1 cost to deal 3 damage in Justice. There's just probably more useful ways to spend your resources. Like making an entrance, for example, is a really good card that if you thwart, gives you +2 to your thwart, and then if you remove all threat, you get to heal. Healing in Justice, very welcome. Sonic Rifle was a huge card for Justice that you could just put it on the table and you would get 2 counters, and you can use those to confuse the villain. And that's just always useful. Being able to go to Alter Ego was so difficult, especially in solo play, that this card became huge for solo so that you could consistently get to Alter Ego to get your special benefits. The Star-Lord neutral ally is probably the worst, not probably, is the worst of the neutral Guardian allies, where he's 2 costs, 2/2 with 3 hit points. That all sounds great. But when he enters play, he gives you a face-on encounter card. And that's cute how it mimics his hero ability, but you just don't get the benefits that really offset that. He should have had maybe a little bit higher stats, maybe only cost 1, maybe have 1 more hit point. I don't know, something about him to offset that encounter card. So it was a cute idea, but I doubt he sees much play. And then this came with the side holster that let you keep an additional restricted item in play, which is nice. And you can see Rocket in the art. There's a reason for that. It's useful for him. Plasma Pistol is a surprisingly useful card, considering that all it does is ping a damage here and there, but you can do a lot with it. And he also came with really good off-aspect cards. Fusillade was sort of like Mean Swing on steroids, just does a lot of damage. Welcome Aboard is basically another double resource for allies, which is fun. And Shake It Off is awesome, that after you take damage, you get a tough status card for 1. Very useful. And Crew Quarters was really good too. It almost replaced the other healing cards, where you every time you go to Alter Ego, you can exhaust it to heal a damage. Just very simple, very cheap, and very effective. So like I said, I know a broken record, but yet another really good Guardian hero. And just like that, that was the end of that cycle. There were only 4 heroes in this one. There were no scenario packs, anything like that. It was just on to the next campaign box.